Okay, so America just went through an election, and a lot of people are happy, and others are freaking out. I got a text message this morning from a guy in India, and he's not a Christian, but he watches politics, and he understands a little bit about Western politics a little bit. But from his perspective, he says the people in India are really excited about Trump. So how are we to understand what's going on? A lot of people, when they get very patriotic, they think that has something to do with their Christianity. But you know, Uncle Sam didn't shed any blood for our sins. So we have to be careful that we don't mistake what's going on in our country with what is going on spiritually speaking. Now there are biblical principles that are very important for us to understand. And like they say, those that don't learn from history, they're destined to repeat it. So it's good that we look at historical events and then see how they shook out. And the Bible has some very interesting stories that we could look at that to some degree parallel what our country is going through. I mean, just for example, take a look at King David. You know, Israel wanted a king. God kept telling him through the prophets that wasn't a good idea, but they kept bugging him because all the other nations had kings, so they wanted a king. So eventually God says, okay, you're going to get a king, and so Saul became their king. But then, you know, it took several decades for Saul's real personality to come to the forefront, and he wasn't exactly what the people needed. At first they thought he was great because he was a big, tall, handsome guy, right? He fit the physical illustrations of perfection. You know, they wanted an attractive Hollywood type and a warrior, and he was. So that was great. However, he had some other issues that later came to the surface. So eventually, of course, what happened was God anoints David, a young lad, to become king. However, he didn't become king right away. It took you know, a decade or so for that to all shake out, for God to remove King Saul. And of course, a lot of the people that were following David's mighty men, the Bible calls them, you know, they oftentimes wanted to take things into their own hands, and they wanted to just go whack Saul, and they had plenty of opportunities to do so. In fact, at one point, Saul was sleeping in a cave, and one of some of David's guys went in the cave, and I think David was with him, and he cut off a portion of Saul's clothing, his skirt, and he stole his spear. And then later, you know, the next morning, when they woke up, they found out David standing on the hillside across the valley, and he says, "Hey, look, pal, I got your sword. I could have killed you last night, but I didn't." You know, right? So in our political situation today, for the past 4 years, we've had a very corrupt political system with Biden and Harris. No question about it. They lie about anything and everything, and they've done everything in their power to destroy Trump's credibility. And he's not a perfect guy. There's no doubt about that. But he's learned some things along the way, and he's had some pretty good ministers that have counseled him, probably some that are not so good, but for the most part, I think he's learned some good spiritual principles along the way. He had one of his ears, you know, shot and nicked by a bullet, which, you know, an inch or so the other direction, he could have been dead. So I think that's a pretty fearful illustration of what could have happened. But God's grace obviously spared him, and he seems to acknowledge that. It seems that over the years, if you watch his personality, he seems to be softening up and gaining some wisdom. And that, of course, the first time that he went into office as president, he knew there was a lot of dubious characters there, and he wanted to drain the swamp. However, he didn't really know for sure who he could trust and who he couldn't trust. And so oftentimes he had to rely on people, because obviously you have to accept people that have expertise in various parts of the government. of our country. So you have to rely on them because, hey, you don't know that much about it. And so he relied on some somewhat dubious characters at times, and then fast forward a couple years, and he finds out that they weren't really to be trusted. So now here we are, fast forward, after the Biden administration's 4 years of screwing things up with open borders and everything else under the sun, and we've had tons of people pouring across our borders. Some are just innocent people looking for a better life, but others, who knows what's involved. I mean, all of our Muslim mosques in our country have increased by incredible. And I have visited lots of Muslim mosques since 9/11, and I've watched them grow. You just go down to Salt Lake Valley and see how many mosques are in Mormonville now. And then here where I live in the eastern Washington, we've got a number of mosques that, a decade or two ago, they didn't even exist. So, and all of a sudden now we've got hundreds of Muslims, and of course mostly men. That's the weird part about it. You go to these mosques and you look around and there's hardly any women, wearing hijabs or anything else. It's just nearly all guys. So what's with that? Do these guys have no families, or have they snuck in to do us harm? So now to take another illustration of the Old Testament, the Jews were warned a number of times in the Old Testament that if they didn't get their act straightened out, that God would bring their neighboring countries to war against them. And Jeremiah, in chapter 29 of Jeremiah, there actually is a very specific prophecy about that. Yeah, as a matter of fact, in 29 verse 10, it actually specifically says that the punishment on Israel is going to be 70 years. And so if you read Daniel and Ezekiel and some of the other prophets, you'll see how they understood that to be a reality, because many of them were packed off into Babylon. Daniel and some of his friends, and the upper crust, the people that had gifts and talents that Babylon could use, they carried them off and they put them to work in Babylon. So then later, 70 years later, and now the difficult part, if you don't know the Bible, if you're not familiar with the Bible, sometimes you may be led to believe that everything is listed in chronological order, and that's not always the case. For example, you fast forward 70 years after that period in Babylon, and you run into this little book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was a guy who was living in Susa, and basically he was one of those that had survived the captivity of this 70-year period, right? And he begins to reminisce about Jerusalem and what it used to be. And he heard reports about people that traveled there, and they came back and said, well, the place is a mess. The walls are all tore down, and of course Babylon destroyed the temple. And in the very first chapter of Nehemiah, in verse 4, it says, it came up about when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So then the political guy that he was working for at the time, King Artaxerxes, began to notice that this guy didn't seem to be too cheerful all of a sudden. And here's another point that's worth mentioning is oftentimes Christians, because our government, of course, is a secular government, they don't vote. And so because they figure, well, there's no Christians that I can vote for, or there's no person that I see that's holy or sanctified that meets their needs or meets their expectations, so therefore they just don't vote. Well, the problem with that is, whether you vote or not, people are going to be put into place. And so you have to choose between the lesser of the two evils. And Christians have a hard time making those kind of decisions. I know of pastors that don't vote because, some of them won't vote for Trump because they said, well, he's got this caustic personality. Well, we have to admit he's a New Yorker, and New Yorker business people tend to have that kind of personality. They're brash and they have to kick butt to get things done. And so the Christians who are always wanting to turn the other cheek, they don't know how to deal with people like that. So they run from them, they hide from them. And so that's one of the problems you run into. So, so what happens here after this 70-year period? Nehemiah, God begins to speak to him. It doesn't say it's in an audible voice or anything, but he lays it on his heart that he would like to go back and be a part of the restoration of the nation of Israel. Because of course, he reads the prophets that this 70-year period is up. So now what do we do, right? And so, to make a long story short, actually the king actually encourages him. He says, do it. I'll give you some soldiers. I'll even finance your expedition. Go down there, check it out, see what you need. And so he does. He goes down there and checks it out if you read the first couple chapters of Nehemiah. But now the interesting part is okay, so here we have Trump comes into office. There's an awful lot of obstacles that he's going to have to deal with. He's got all kinds of economic issues. He's got all kinds of moral issues. He's got the public school system, which has been invaded by the LGBTQ bunch. And then you got all kinds of ethnic issues that are on his plate. And him being a white guy, of course, he's going to be accused of being a racist, And that's an easy card to pull whenever you can't find any other reason to get rid of somebody. Call him a racist. That always works. I've had people use it on me, and I have friends that are Mexicans and blacks and everything under the sun. Filipinos. I've played music with one of my good friends, bass player, plays music with me. Filipino guy, great guy. So when somebody calls me a racist, well, they're stooping pretty low in their accusations. But as Christians, we understand that our accuser is the devil, and he stirs up people to attack us, and that's quite often what he uses. He uses not only just accusations, but he'll trump up legal charges against us if he can. And of course, if you've been watching the history of Trump and his battles, they've taken what we call now lawfare, and they went after him. And anybody associated with him, anybody that could help him financially or legally, they went after him. So, well, that's the same type of thing that Nehemiah dealt with. Here God has put it on his heart to go back and restore the temple. But right away, when he gets there, you find out in chapter 2, verse 19 and 20 and whatnot, you'll see that this guy by the name of Sanballat and a few other characters, Geshem, the Arab, they begin to mock him, and when that didn't work, and quite often that's what the enemy will do. He will try to mock you. Well, you're just some stupid Christian, what you're doing is a waste of time. You're out evangelizing, speaking to people about Jesus. Isn't that sweet? I just ran into a guy just this morning. I was down in a public park in Richland, and there was a guy fishing down there, so I got to talking to him, and he claimed to be a Christian, but every other sentence had the F word in it, so I called him on it, and immediately this guy come on court. He basically started threatening me physically. He says, "Get away from me, you effing blankety blank blank." And he made some of the weirdest accusations. He says, "You claim to be a Christian. Do you eat red meat?" And I went, "Well, Jesus ate the Passover lamb. So are you suggesting I should be a vegetarian, or where are we going with this?" And well, he was the same age as me. He was 72 years old. But he was a little skinny guy, so I guess I was too fat, to be a Christian. So anyway, these are some of the weird accusations that you get thrown at you. Well, see, Nehemiah had the same thing happen to him. Just read through the book of Nehemiah. It has some really good illustrations of how the devil will come after you if you're doing something for God. If you're building a church, or you're building a ministry of any kind, doesn't matter whether it's an evangelistic parachurch deal or foreign missions, it doesn't matter. There's opposition that comes with it. Now, of course, in the New Testament, we read, we don't war against flesh and blood. People are not our enemies, but against spiritual powers in heavenly places, all right? Principalities and powers, it says in Ephesians. So, of course, the illustration that the writer is using there comes out of the book of Daniel, where Daniel's praying, and then next thing you know, an angel appears to him, right? And this angel says, from the first day that you humbled yourself and started praying, I've come to answer your prayer. However, there's this prince of Persia, there's this other demonic force I had to battle against. And so these are some illustrations in the Old Testament that the New Testament writers picked up on to help us understand what's going on in the realm of the Spirit. Now, see, in the Old Testament, however, you don't see much about demons. You don't see anything about demonology really until you get to the New Testament, where Jesus casts out demons and he's tempted by the devil and that sort of thing. Under the Old Testament, it's somewhat of a fatalistic picture that we see. Like in the book of Job, Job didn't know it was the devil that was harassing him. He thought everything was coming from God. So you have to understand these type of principles. And the Bible tells us, it warns us against unprincipled men. So biblical principles are really important. So reading through the book of Nehemiah, as they begin to build the wall, Sanballat and Tobiah, the Ammonite, and some of the others, they begin to come and mock them. And when that didn't work, then they tried to scare them. And of course, these guys are building, and it says that they carried a weapon in one hand while they worked with the other hand. Now, can you imagine being on a construction site where you have to carry weapons? I mean, that's a little cumbersome, be packing around a weapon or a spear or bow and arrow, whatever they had in those days, and then having to have your sledgehammer and your saws and chisels and everything else that you had to use. So, but these guys were, of course, they were intimidated, right? And good reason to be, because they knew their history. They knew that people hated the Jews, and a lot of people today hate the Jews for no reason, right? So then when you get down to chapter 6, you see this picture of Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and these guys. When they find out that just intimidating them didn't work, then they tried this religious thing. They just, well, come down off the wall and let's go into the house of God and let's talk about this. In other words, come on in, let's praise the Lord and let's get spiritual. Now, sometimes that's the accusation that you hear out on the mission field. If you're doing evangelism, the people will say, that stuff should be reserved for church. You don't have any business out doing this on the street. This is a secular country. We all have freedom of speech, blah, blah, blah. But that stuff there you need to keep in your church. You don't need to be bringing that out here, blah, 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 because, we have freedom of religion here. You shouldn't be trying to impose your views on us, blah, blah, blah. That's another way of trying to get you to shut up, see? And so let's play church. That's basically what they're trying to get them to do. And a lot of churches, that is what they've become. They've become secular or sometimes, Christian, but they have more secular principles than they do biblical principles. And so they don't want to lose their 501c3 tax exempt status. So, the board will say, no, Pastor, you need to be quiet about that. Don't address the LGBT crowd, or don't address the Muslims or the Mormons, because, they might cut off the government. They might sue you, and then, of course, you're going to lose your 501c3 tax exempt status and blah, blah, blah. See, so these are another one of the games the devil uses. Nehemiah, though, he was pretty sharp, and he prayed about that and basically tells him, buzz off, go away. I'm not going to play your religious game. And so you have to be aware of that, because if you're out doing evangelism of any kind, you're going to have religious folks show up and try to talk you out of your method. And they're going to tell you that their method, you have to love them, brother. You don't want to offend people. And they will use the illustration, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. However, we're not after flies. In any way, the Lord of the flies is the devil. Okay? So you have to understand these principles. But a lot of times church people don't understand these principles because, and I've run into pastors. They've been pastors maybe their whole life. They grew up in church, and they are really not very street smart. And so, they've spent all their time counseling church people, and marrying and burying people, but they've spent very little of their time out talking to people that are lost and are demonized, and they're caught up in sin, and they are very, very brash and hard to deal with. And so they avoid people like that. Like the guy that I dealt with this morning. This guy starts cussing me out, and eventually he started threatening me physically, and I just eventually said, okay, pal. I said, obviously you're not a Christian, because you don't have a clue what you're talking about. You got a filthy mouth, and the Bible says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And of course, he was really getting pretty worked up. And the weird part about it, there was another young guy there that he was mentoring, a 30-year-old guy, trying to show him how to fish, right? And this young guy, I had no idea where he was coming from, but he was really quiet, and you could tell he was a little embarrassed by this guy's reaction to me, simply because I was trying to share with him some biblical principles that out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, and you're not living up to the Christian standard of a Christian, And so, anyway, the book of Nehemiah, that's a lesson. It's a parable for us today, and it's worth reading through. There's some great things to learn there.